Hi guys, Luton here, welcome back for episode 42 of Below the Line. Now last week we discussed, should leaning be an expected mechanic for FPS? We'll have the answers from your comments coming up later in the episode. We were talking about should that be default and not a sticky system as exists now in games which have to ensure consoles have this feature because they're not necessarily enough options for extra keys on the controller as it stands. Well, as some of you pointed out, this should actually be already possible with some controllers that are coming up and even existing mechanics that already feature in some games like Siege for console. However, it brought me to thinking on a topic that I have mused before, which is specifically about the controllers for consoles and their limitations, because let's just be clear, at this point in time controllers are probably one of the things which limits them specifically in terms of accessing games which require a wider and more detailed control system. Developers come up with ingenious methods of allowing gameplay to function with limited controls, but it still means that some games end up not really being even considered properly, along with the fact that RTS and top-down strategy games like Total War and Company of Heroes end up barely being an option for console players. If I still owned a console, it would certainly be something that I would want. Now, other controller options have existed as well in the past, like Frag FX, it's still a thing, which is a chuck mouse combo tool giving you the ability to have mouse quality control in console FPS. I used it before, it worked very well. My philosophy when it comes to these kind of things is, look, if it exists, you can use it. It's not cheating in my book any more than somebody, say, just having two different mouse variations when playing on PC is cheating. If hardware exists and you prefer it and you can buy it, go for it. Despite the argument of obviously having a balanced playing field, it's baffled me for the longest time that consoles have resisted any kind of option to give players mouse and keyboard, or even some iteration of this. Keyboards can be quite small now, and really sitting with a small board on your lap if you want to sit in the living room and game is honestly not a big deal. Again, I've done it myself, it's really not that big of a problem, it's not that uncomfortable. Still, the setup is probably the biggest sticking point to the whole deal that consoles are generally designed for. And it's designed for, and please you guys don't get ready to start shouting, okay, just have a seat, sit down. Consoles, generally speaking, generally are designed more toward a casual gamer market. The kind of person who wants to get home, jump in a few games, maybe watch a movie, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But shouldn't there also be options for people who want to have a console setup but get games with more complex detailed control systems without maybe needing to do a whole PC gaming setup? Even though you can get good and feasible PC gaming setups for quite a reasonable low amount of money now. But maybe you're, say, a younger gamer, you can't afford that whole PC setup, or maybe your parents just don't want you to have it. But getting a keyboard and mouse console setup that would work, that wouldn't be so exclusionary from a price or a setup point of view. Now, it's of course fair to say that the benefits here would only apply to some specific game genres, namely anything that's of an RTS nature or anything with a more simulation heading that by its nature requires more keybinds, but also some point and click games. Just having the option there to do these kind of things really doesn't seem like it should be a big deal. But we come to the real sticking point, which is that with FPS games, they can't deal with the fact that a keyboard and mouse setup is of course always going to destroy a controller setup every time. It's one of the main reasons why I moved from console back to PC, along with the extortionate console prices of games and limited access to indies, along with of course being able to mod, update, customize your setup, peripherals, all the other stuff. So the ultimate question today, should consoles just step up and start looking for ways to give some simplified keyboard mouse functionality? I feel for sure this could be done, and at the very least they should start heading toward some of those controller adaptations we see with rear paddles to give people more control options for the players, more bind options for the players. This is quite a wide-reaching topic, so I expect your replies are going to reflect that, but please as always tell me your thoughts down below, and the best ones are going to feature in next week's Below the Line. Now last week we were talking about another mechanic in games and whether this should be something which is default mandatory, that of leaning in FPS. Should we just expect this as something which is par for the course right now? We had a ton of good responses, and Kron comes in and says, I don't think leaning should be in every FPS game. Some games like Call of Duty, Titanfall 2, Doom and many others are very fast paced in nature and leaning wouldn't matter much. It could even hurt the gameplay by slowing it down, and the selling point of these games are their fast-paced twitch shooter action. Also, on another note, I don't think leaning is limited because of consoles at all. Like some people are saying, look at Rainbow Six Siege, you can lean on consoles by pressing right stick or left stick while aiming down sight. Sure, you're limited to being able to do it when you're in ADS, but most of the time if you lean, you're going to want an ADS. Even the right and left bumper R1, L1 could be used. You don't need to throw grenades or melee while you're ADSing, do you? Well, it depends, I guess. But anyway, he says, that being said, I do agree that it's time for consoles, though, to design controllers with a few more buttons, as we were talking about today. Xbox One Elite controller and Razer's Raiju PS4 controller, which are the controllers I actually showcased at the start of this, are what the future of console gaming should look like. And I pretty much agree there. I mean, it's not to say necessarily, I mean, we can always pick examples where it's going to be more beneficial than not. My point is simply that it should be something that's there by default, because if you have it, you can choose to use it or not. But if you don't have it at all, you can end up feeling kind of handicapped, which is often how I do feel in some specific situations. Because that's the whole point of leaning. Leaning is not something which you use consistently all the time, unless maybe you're in like a very urban environment, but it's the fact that when it is not there, that it feels like you are most hamstrung. Now, Fraser here gets confused, but unintentionally ends up making a good point, where he says something like wall leaning isn't necessarily needed in FPS games. Not every game needs to copy Battlefield. He got confused in thinking that when I'm talking about leaning, I'm speaking about how Battlefield leaning works in terms of going up to an object. So he's thinking where I was saying that all games should have the style of leaning that you have in Battlefield, where actually, of course, we're talking more about entirely separate leaning mechanics of more simulation style games. And this is actually a really good, but also completely accidental comment, where what he's saying is yeah, in games where you have a lean mechanic where you go up near an object like Battlefield and then it kind of, you know, because you're close to an object, you lean. Well, here's the thing, very often when you're near that object, it kind of triggers automatically. So it actually takes away control for the player. For whatever reason in that circumstance, you may not wish to actually lean. You might want to do something else. Or if at a certain time the game is kind of being weird and buggy and it might kind of screw you over, and it's those moments where something kind of gets fucked up, or you're near to an object and it kind of triggers it when you didn't really mean to, or you were trying to aim at something else, and it's like that's when you get killed. And those critical moments can matter a lot. Whereas with the more separated leaning system that you have in games like Siege and Arma and Squad, all the control is with the player. The player has the control to choose when you lean. It could be at any time, there could be a specific reason. It gives you a lot more control, it gives you a lot more options, and it gives the player basically, again, the skill choice. Apex comes in to say, when it comes to leaning and peeking, I feel it's pretty much mandatory at this point. For the past 7 months I've been competitively playing Rainbow Six Siege, and coming from Battlefield I can say it is very frustrating going back to any game that doesn't have leaning and peeking. It has gotten to the point where I don't really play any other competitive FPS games because they don't have this feature, which is sad because I still really enjoy Battlefield 4 when I do play it. However, I think it's more important to focus on which games it's put in, because with fast-paced FPS games you wouldn't have time to use it in games like Overwatch, it just wouldn't fit. I think that's kind of obvious, I kind of thought that was implied, but anyway. He says it would make sense to put it in games that are going for a more real approach to combat, so yeah, simulation. Siege PC you use Q and E and left to lean, and lean left and right, and you can lean while ADS, but not on console, it's L3 and R3, so as a downside you can only do it when you're ADSing, as we discussed earlier. I really want to see this in Battlefield 5, as it would make the game a lot more dynamic, and we'd see a lot less people dying because they had to expose their entire body, making the game feel more real. I don't like the term real, but okay. But I don't think it's something that EA and DICE are going to put in the game unless they can make money from it. Keep up the good work, love the Below the Line episodes. The only point I would make here is that I really don't think money is a factor in determining whether or not they're going to add something like this in there, not directly anyway, but it definitely would be a factor, I guess, in terms of just the functionality of the game and how much they think it would change things, maybe change the pace, and so indirectly then, yeah, perhaps actually it is, you know, a monetary consideration. Trumps comes in and says, the leaning is a great benefit, but what blows my mind is the lack of support for track IR and the like in any game that has any pretense of being realistic. Again, I hate the term real in games, but anyway. The ability to look around as you can in real life independently of the direction you're moving, your body pointing adds to immersion, reality and situational awareness than anything. Having a track IR user since its first release, I can seriously not bring myself to play games that don't support the ability to free look. Well look, forget about track IR because it's a way too specific thing. Personally myself, I also find it a little bit janky, but we are moving ever more towards VR, and VR definitely could be something which in an FPS game enables you to free look, but still, even at its most basic perspective, just being able to hold Alt and look around you, definitely whilst running in one direction, makes a really big difference to your situational awareness, and it definitely makes a big difference in terms of just kind of looking around you and being able to react. All of these kind of extra controls, the point here is that anything like this, even whether it's leaning or whether it's free looking around, enables you to make better decisions. It enables you to maybe see targets and so on that you couldn't previously, and this is one of the ever ongoing problems with these games, which the controls and the systems are more static and more confined, it just kind of prevents you from saving yourself in different situations, constraining the user and ultimately constraining the type of gameplay that you have. It's less dynamic, it's less exciting. Speed and the amount of bodies you can throw at something is not automatically just what equals exciting. In fact, if anything, that's actually what can make things more boring. Making situations where they are more dynamic in terms of control system, in terms of player decision, that's what makes it more exciting, because it gives more control to you, it gives more decision making to you, and it gives more information to you. And those are the things that make gameplay more exciting, more interesting, more reasons to communicate. That's the direction we should really be heading in my opinion, across the board for FPS. Sid Tai comes in and says, I don't like leaning precisely because of the reasons that you like it. The ability to not expose yourself when shooting or not expose yourself so much is too strong. How about we eliminate leaning and you actually have to pick a time to peek out of cover to shoot people? That would be a more tactical choice. If you need to shoot, you need to expose yourself. It's a trade-off. Is that right though? I kind of realised when I was looking back through the comments this week that I actually unintentionally picked more comments that disagree with me than agree with me, but that's okay because this series is not about just proving my point correct, it's about having a discussion and showcasing different points of view from people. It's about having interesting perspectives and discussing around the topic, not just, a chain of yes people going, yeah, we agree with you, LT. But personally, I'm going to disagree with Sid here, and if you disagree or agree, tell me your thoughts in the comments on this as well, as per usual. But leaning is definitely not something which is too strong to put into games, for a very simple reason. Leaning exists already in many games and many different styles of games, not just simulations like Arma. Squad is a slower style of gameplay for sure, but even in Battlefield, leaning exists as it is right now. If you want to, you can use extra cover. It doesn't sort of pop you out necessarily, but people don't have issues with leaning in games, even the more simulation games. It doesn't factor in terms of people thinking it's too OP or whatever. If you have a position of cover, you have a position of cover. It's down to you to find ways to get around that by either flanking, getting snipers from different range positions, throwing grenades. Even when you're leaning in squad, you can easily pick that person off if you have a good position, because ultimately you are still exposing yourself. It just requires more accuracy, more awareness, more planning, and just generally being a better player. So just saying it's OP and therefore it shouldn't be in the game doesn't stand up. It's not a legitimate argument. eBunny comes in saying, this makes me think of how video games, and in this case FPS games in particular, have developed over the years and how certain mechanics have become normal and accepted. Mechanics like ADS, crouching prone, a quick melee, sprinting health that automatically regenerates after not taking damage for a while, recoil, bullet spread. These are some of the things that come to mind that are pretty standard for a lot of FPS games now. If you include third-person games, an obvious example is the cover mechanic a la Gears of War. However, some games do stray away from these trends and might perhaps go back to older games where instead of regenerating health, you had an HP bar where you didn't have ADS and sprinting, etc. Games like CSGO, Overwatch, and of course most recent iterations of Quake, Unreal, Doom come to mind, and of course a lot of indie games like to stray away from the norm and experiment, often also taking inspiration from older games. So what about leaning then? Do we want this to be another expected mechanic in FPS games? I definitely think it adds a lot to games where it makes sense, like Squad and Insurgency, and I think some games could benefit from having a mechanic like that. However, I don't think that any mechanic should really be mandatory or taken for granted across an entire genre of games. It all comes down to the design of the game and how you want it to be played and experienced. In a lot of games, I don't think a leaning mechanic would add much. For example, there are games that are supposed to be very fast-paced. I do feel like a leaning mechanic lends itself more to a methodical and tactical shooter, where you don't want to expose yourself too much, games with a short time to kill. So I guess the point really is that every mechanic we add or don't add is a design decision, and that we shouldn't just add mechanics for the sake of it. You should always think about what kind of game you want to make and whether a particular mechanic or feature aligns with your vision rather than just mindlessly copying other games. Of course, that doesn't mean you always have to reinvent the wheel. It doesn't hurt to use what works, but I think a lot of interesting designs can come from questioning or challenging the norm. Maybe you don't even want to have a jump mechanic in your game, for example. So yeah, think critically. It makes a lot of good points, and I think where we ended up with this week was people really discussing about more the way in which mechanics are implemented between games and why those decisions are made depending on whatever it is. But specifically in relation to this week's question, I think quite honestly I didn't phrase the question for this week well enough, because my question was, should this be something that we just see in all FPS games? And I think people have taken that a little bit too literally. when I'm trying to think up questions or topics for you guys, in my mind there's often things where I maybe wrongly assume people will just join the dots and understand what I'm saying, when of course you actually need to make it very, very clear. And my question could have simply been rephrased to say, would it be a good thing for us to see more lean mechanics in more FPS games because of how it benefits the player, and then gone on to list and explain some of those benefits and positive elements. Now, it won't surprise you at all that the demographic of my YouTube channel is in the generally 20 to 40 year old range, so it's always interesting when I hear comments from younger gamers like Quinn here, who says, I think leaning in a game is a good thing, but it kind of pushes the idea that you want to take things slowly and carefully. And games with fast pace have kind of become oversaturated these days. It's kind of getting boring for, I think, all of us. He says, sorry if this comment's hard to read because I'm using my voice to talk for it. And also games like Fortnite, Far Cry 5 have become a shoot 'em up type of game where you want to just keep pushing. You don't care if you die, and then you're just going to respawn. I think that's absolutely true and goes back to what I was saying just a minute ago. He says, since I'm 14, I've talked to my middle school friends about this, and they don't really grasp the idea that this is really a problem, and just keep saying that the newest Call of Duty is the best game ever, which is of course a great surprise. He says, I also talked to them about loot crates in games, and they don't seem to understand that. It's all they know, and games used to be much better because I played older games like Skyrim and even RimWorld, which of course is an indie game. They're much better despite their not having next-gen graphics. But besides that, leaning would be a great thing to have in all games, and maybe add a sense of realism to the games. Again, I don't like realism, but okay. Not all games have to have it, like Fortnite, which embraces this running around feel, but I think most games should have it. Thanks for doing what you do, LT. I appreciate the series and keep it up. And look, some of his points there are not particularly specific, but what it's getting towards is something that I've been saying for a long time, which of course is that generationally within gaming, people's perspectives start to shift. And this is why when we've talked about loot boxes, but more so related to leaning and so on, when we're talking specifically about mechanics in games and the feel of games and the pace of games, if that's all you know and that's all you're encouraged to play and that's all you have access to, then of course that becomes the norm for you and that's what you expect, and then you don't see that this is a big issue within games. And so trying to encourage younger players to expand their horizons and go, hey, look at these other games and think about this, and wouldn't the game be better if you did it like this? Otherwise what you end up with is where we're headed towards, which is just this ever going gravy train of sort of, you know, over mass marketed, hyped up games which just generally present the same meat grinding, very, very tiring experience, which becomes ultimately boring with very little of interest going on in it. And I think that's the most important thing, and it ties directly into what we're saying here, which is that by adding more detail, by adding more options, by expanding your gameplay choices, that's a positive thing. It creates a better experience, a more interesting, more immersive experience, and that ultimately delivers a better title for the player. So then lastly today, Zomagod says, after playing games with lean, going back to games without feels like only having one arm instead of two. I completely agree, that's how I felt with Far Cry recently. So for me, all games should have the option to lean, but I can also understand why some games don't. Sometimes additional buttons to press can make a game less easy to get into for new players, and that is something a lot of games try to reduce to the point of making games very bare bones if you want to be negative, or streamlined if you want to be positive about it. I think that it is more interesting when the game has more depth and stuff to learn and in general gives the player more options, but that doesn't seem to be the direction of the masses, and the masses dictate the direction within sales. So ultimately that's where we come to, is this idea that essentially what you're offering people is more options, more choice, again like I've been talking about, more depth, more dynamic gameplay for people. But it seems that many people don't want those options. What they want is the fast-paced meat grinder. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to say that that's the direction for the main mass market audience to be headed towards, because what that can mean is that other games like Squad that sit adjacent to those mass market games provide something for an alternative community. They provide something for the players who want to get that experience, and so long as you support those games, so long as you support those experiences, those things are always going to be there. And that's what is actually a really, really important takeaway within this, which is that if we don't get more mechanics, if we don't get more leaning elements, if we don't get other things like this, which we know to be positive, we know to be a good thing, we know to enhance the gameplay, if that stuff doesn't come to the mass market, well, so be it. But what you then have to do is you have to go to the places where the games are implementing those things, like Insurgency, like Squad. You need to support those titles, you need to play those titles, you need to tell other people about them, try and encourage players to come in and try and experience something different, because by doing so, you're making sure that those communities exist, you're making sure that those games survive, you're making sure that developers understand that there is a market for that. And that's something that people just generally need to be aware of, need to remember, and need to actively promote and do. As always guys, thanks for watching very much indeed. I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy, please drop a like and maybe share the video. It helps me, it helps the channel. And if you have a comment to make, please, as always, don't drop a wall of text. Format it so it's easier for me to read if I include it on next week's video. I'll see you guys next time for some more Below the Line.